important aspect of Jack Katz's work is that he has published extensively on research methodology, and his current work focuses on history and street life, specifically in Los Angeles, and has joined us greatly, and we're deeply thankful for sharing his time to speak with us in the study group on the classics of critical criminology. And if I may add to all that presentation, it's a great pleasure of having actually someone who's a contemporary classic among us to discuss a little bit about his trajectories and maybe where can we move forward from his contribution to intellectual thought. Professor Jack, the floor is yours.
Thanks. Thank you, Victor. And it is a pleasure to try to make contact across this distance, and maybe more the distance intellectually. The intellectual tradition is even greater than the geographic distance, which is enormous. But let's see how great the intellectual difference is. Probably the one main thing I have to say today, and that I see as the thrust of what my work is on crime, is the importance, the value of starting with the thing you're trying to explain. You could call it the dependent variable, the explanandum, the thing you're trying to explain, and to set up an empirical or scientific explanation, variation in it. Sometimes in my writing, I refer to that as getting close to the phenomenon, as ethnographers often use that kind of language. But it means putting theories of explanation aside for the moment and looking at how people are doing whatever they consider criminal or deviant. So that immediately kind of changes the research from two different influences. And one is academic. In the intellectual traditions, the explanation is what's given emphasis, the theory. So it could be Durkheim, Marx, Bourdieu, Gramsci, whoever. But it's striking if you look at the work of the people who are considered the great theorists, how little they give you on the detail of people actually doing the thing they're trying to explain. And for me, my sense is that's what a scientist does. That's natural science, that you go to the thing itself. You, of course, are concerned with theory in the sense of a generalizing explanation. But in the first instance, you're a naturalist. You just try to see the variations in the thing you're trying to explain. Now, that the other perspective that separates you from is the conventional, popular, cultural, political, official perspective. Because crime is defined officially by the criminal justice system, by the public, by politicians, by the effects of some behavior on the victims. And that immediately, that concern for victims and for defining crime that way immediately distorts the description, the understanding, the characterization of the phenomenon. So, for example, in all legal systems, attempts to hurt somebody that don't end up hurting them are treated differently as the same behavior that hurts somebody. So immediately, I mean, every legal system makes that distinction. If you shoot and miss, it's not the same crime. It doesn't have the same penalty as if you shoot and hit. And if you shoot and hit and the person dies, it's not the same as if you shoot and hit and the person doesn't die. But it's the same behavior to the person doing the activity. So if you're a natural scientist and you're trying to understand the phenomena as it exists, that means the homogeneous courses of action that people take when they do the actions that sometimes hit, sometimes miss, sometimes hit and kill, sometimes hit and just injure, and sometimes are forgotten about, are not treated as significant because they don't hit. They're all the same. So if that's the case, then the variations you're looking for to explain are not going to be between murders and non-murders or changes in murder rates. They're going to be changes from one moment to the other in getting oriented to, beginning, getting committed to, following through on a course of action that has the same practical and kind of perspectival. You're trying to do the same thing. In those are your cases, people trying to do the same thing, whether or not the result is. Now that immediately alienates you from the official view of crime, and it makes it problematic and really sets up a kind of, I would say, almost a moral challenge for you as a researcher, because you're kind of paid to study crime as it's understood officially. But if you're following a naturalist effort, you're really not staying loyal to that. And are you okay with that? Do you receive the rewards as a criminologist by people who think you're going to study what they think of as crime? I mean, you can work with that. It's not the biggest moral problem, ethical problem you're going to face, but there is that tension. And in this Beyond the Seductions of the State, I tried to bring out all the ways that I could think of that a naturalist study of crime, if you follow it, you get separated, alienated from the official version of crime and what most criminologists study. It's not just what the politicians want. It's not just what the public wants. It's what most of your colleagues are going to be doing, because they want to understand differences in crime rates. I was reading some of Victor's work, and if you look at riots, well, this question, this example of attempts versus shots that hit and kill, it holds for all kinds of crimes. I mean, if you try to study riots, there aren't that many events, unless you do a big historical comparative investigation, create a big data set for a lot of time. But there are lots of moments, situations where people may move towards a riot and then it never happens. And those are, in some sense, they should be as interesting and revealing and methodologically compelling as the times that riots do come off. And then even in riots that do come off, there's the phase just before it started. So, to the public, a riot is important. We don't want riots. So it's a kind of dummy variable. They happen or they don't happen. But when you get into it, they start, sometimes they stop, sometimes they go through some phases, sometimes they stop, other times they go through more phases. So I've done some work on riots in connection with the studies. Most of my time in the last several years have been studying in Los Angeles, a neighborhood study in Hollywood, of different Hollywoods, because Hollywood became super diverse in ethnicity, historical background, the population. It's not where the movie it's a little bit where the movie stars live, but it's mostly Latino, immigrant, and all kinds of other populations. It's very interesting. But in part, that got me into studying Los Angeles, and so I got caught up at one point with the so-called Rodney King riots in the early 1990s. And what's striking to me about riots, and I did a little bit of writing about that I published, and I'll be publishing more, but is this kind of epiphany of invisibility, that in order to participate in a riot, people have to come to understand that they're going to be invisible effectively, even though they're super visible, in the sense that they're doing these illegal criminal things with a lot of other people all around them. And these days, with TV cameras all over and then mounted, recording devices, but there are other people around you that you don't know. So you don't have any guarantee these people are not going to turn on you and, report you. But how do you get to that sense? To me, that's the unique thing of riots. It's this epiphany of invisibility. How do you get to the point where I guess in Brazil, they behead people. How do you get to the point where you think that you can do that? I mean, there's all kinds of questions about like that. How do you actually practically do that? And how does that become something that you can generate the emotions, the physical control to do, the emotions but it's also how do you think that people won't be so struck by that they'll find you, because you're not doing that usually, as I understand it, in private with one person around. There's other people around. And it's an extraordinary confidence that's built up that somehow you're going to be invisible, even though you're hyper visible. So that's a kind of variation in the explanandum, okay? In the thing you're trying to explain, from people feeling I'm too visible if I break into that store. I'm too visible if I attack that person. Other people will see me and they'll report on me, and so I'm not going to do it. Then all of a sudden, even though I don't have a mask on my face, even though I'm not alone, there are people all around me, all of a sudden it makes sense to me to do it. That's the transformation. Now that isn't what the public focuses on. They want, why does riots happen here and not there? Why is it happening more often? But the proto riots, the incipient riots, when all the conditions start to build up. So what are all those conditions that build up? And the most revealing evidence is probably when you have some of the conditions, but not all. And yet we end up usually with data sets, looking at data sets on positive cases. So the naturalist kind of impulse, which is just a fascination with the thing itself. You know, when I studied laughter, how do people laugh? What do they do with their body? How do they start laughing and how do they stop laughing? Like there's your variation. If you don't have variation, and a lot of sociologists, you know, a lot of theory on crime manages to do a lot of writing without really talking about variation. It just takes, like, there's an example and then it's spun out and it's woven together with all other kinds of patterns in society to make some kind of characterization. But the more or less the change from moment to moment is not necessarily focused on. I'm not sure what should I did an article called Start Here that I published in Theoretical Criminology maybe 20 odd years ago. And really it specifies in a way that's in both the crime book and the emotions book my understanding of social ontology. And social ontology may be a phrase familiar to you or maybe not, but it's what I understand it to mean is like what's going on in every moment of social life. What are the things that are in any moment of social life, what's happening? And really, probably my entrance into it was through studying with Howie Becker and being then sensitive to social interaction, getting very kind of influenced by Irving Goffman and the conversation analysts. And so we're still on, right? Because something's happened to my screen. I don't know, but we're okay, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
we're okay.
Okay. We're back. There we are. Okay. So the first element. So okay, why am I talking about social ontology? So if you're going to look at the phenomenon itself, is there any guidance for your work other than that simple phrase? Look at the phenomenon. How do you do that? How do you get close to the phenomenon? Like ethnographers, participant, observer, researchers like to say they want to get close to the phenomenon. How do you do that? Well, you look for the dimensions of social ontology, and what are those dimensions? And how do you know whether you've missed something? Well, you need to think about what social ontology is, what's going on in every act. So whatever you're studying, what do you have to look to? What do you have to describe? So the first is interaction. And that's probably Herbert Blumer was the most emphatic in stating that, coming out of George Herbert Mead and other pragmatists. And then we find also a second element is a pragmatist element. You've got to go through certain practical activities. You know, you want to kill somebody, there's certain practical things you have to do. You want to steal something, there are certain practical things you have to do. And third, there's a kind of embodied transformation. You have to, a certain emotion or certain mood. Now, it has to be developed. And in the crime book, probably one of the most kind of memorable transformations is from the transformation from humiliation to rage in what I call righteous slaughter. There's something that's changing. So these are all changes in the situation in the act that help you define what the act is. So that gives you the guidance of how to create your own data set. And it's a data set set up for causal explanation because it's about change from moment to moment. I think before I forget, I want to emphasize the opportunity now that some people are taking, and in a lot of work that I've done, but that's not yet been published, I've been studying violence in videotapes. And what's great about videotapes is that videotapes of naturally occurring violence is that they allow you to see violence as it's actually occurring in ways nobody has ever studied it. In some sense, you know, if you could have an ongoing videotape of a riot, which is incredibly difficult. I know people in Germany who've tried to work with materials that have some videos on riots, but there's so many people involved. There are so many angles. But so you can start with something simple. And what I found with Don Wienink in Amsterdam, I've been working, there's a lot of fights that break out in public transportation. And the data we have is in English, and it comes from English-speaking countries. Public transportation, in a lot of places, there are recording devices going on, and put in by the transportation system, but also people just whip out their phones these days if they're passengers not involved in the fight. And while that affects the combatants, the people who get into the fight, and you have to keep that in mind, you get fabulous material, and you can see over time the movement into and then out of the fight. You can see the phases. You can see what the contingencies are. So if you really want to develop a really tight, empirically documented causal explanation of violence, these are materials there that some people are starting to analyze. Wienink has published a number of things, and so have others, but I think he's done the best published work so far. Randall Collins has done some work, but methodologically, the way he works is not quite as effective, I think. But the thing, I mean, there's the real challenge. When you have the actual data, I mean, you know, if you want to study insects, are you going to look at the insect and how it develops, or are you going to look at a book, an Audubon book of drawings, or you know, a naturalist drawings, and you go to the thing and you look at it. So now we have the thing. And so also, I don't know where each of you are in your careers and whether you can choose these things, but if you had the choice to select the topic in criminology to focus on, and you really were most concerned to be a naturalist kind of scientist, you might want to look at stuff that you can get on videotape. On the other hand, you know, lots of times we want to, and I've written myself on riots and things that are very hard to videotape, that you need other data. And this thing is, I'm not saying you should just use videotape, but it illustrates well the challenge to traditional criminology. Once you look at that kind of material and you see the questions you can ask and what causal processes look like, it kind of, I wouldn't say it spoils you for other ways of work, but it informs you in ways that keep informing you and keep giving you interesting questions about, you know, working at greater distance from phenomena, because, you know, you really have the non-event before it starts, and then you have the progressive, and then you have stages. And the violence isn't just yes or no. It does have patterns within it. When people get into fights, for example, there's a beginning, a first blow, but then there's a kind of rhythm that gets set up in a physical fight. And these are not with knives or guns. These are punching fights. But there are phases. You can see the phases. Well, I'm not going to go into in detail any of the substantive studies. Here's one other point. I did a piece on what I call intimate massacres, and this was an effort to try to at least get familiar with and feel out what it would be like to study these what's sometimes called rampage. Kathy Newman called these rampages, when kids go into schools and shoot up lots of people. And the first thing from my way of working that you start to see is that you can't use the official data sets because they lump together all sorts of things. They can't lose, like a data set on school shootings will lump together all kinds of events that are not necessarily meaning the same thing, done in the same way by participants. You have to start to subdivide, and the first contribution is to come up with some kind of subcategory, some kind of segregated population of cases. In this instance, I called it intimate massacres, which meant that the person was attacking in a scene that had intimate meaning to them, but they're also kind of attacking how other people see them in a place that they understand. The other people hold an image of them. Whether that's right or wrong is not, for what I'm trying to get across now, relevant, but it's just that you have to come up with these terms that are going to sound, I don't know, overly literate, I don't know what, and creative, like righteous slaughter, or sneaky thrills, or intimate massacres, and that all of a sudden will make a lot of people uncomfortable because they want to talk about assaults or robberies or murders. And, but in a sense, you're discovering, like I sense, like a naturalist, a new species of butterfly, whatever. And it's got something to do with the other butterflies, but it's different. Or a new suborder. So I think it's a challenge personally in how you organize your career, because the people who set up a class on criminology for you to teach, they expect you, and the students who come, they come with popular cultural images, and they come with the questions that the newspapers ask: why is murder going up or down? And you come with, at hand, already developed resources supplied by the government, like data sets. I was kind of like in this seductions, beyond the seductions of the state thing. I knew Frank Zimmering from law school, and I always respected his work, especially on gun violence. And he's done great work, but he did this book on why crime went down in New York. He credited Bratton and the police, and he, in some passage in there, and I cited in that paper, he says, well, since nothing else has really changed in the social life of New York in these 20 years or so, we can credit these declines to what the police chief did. And what's happened in New York is the population, kind of like LA at the same time in history, went from overwhelmingly native born, US born households to households that were almost like 2/3 foreign born. or, they had either one or two they were all first generation or they were first and second generation people, but the foreign-born cultures were there. So you're looking at US influences, and you're only thinking about variables of what happens in the US in households that in New York are like from all over. In LA, it's okay, mostly Mexican, Central American, but also Persia, all kinds of places in the Middle East, and all over the world. Well, New York is much more diverse and spread out. And it's just amazing to think that New York in 1990 or 2000 was the same as New York in 1970, 1980. It's just, it's almost like if you were trying to, if you had all the people in New York in 1980 left, and everybody in New York came from Switzerland. It had a big kind of change, and all of a sudden you sent everybody away out of New York, and you filled up all these spaces with Swiss people. And then you see a decline in crime, and you look at what the police chief has done. I mean, it's unbelievable how somebody so sophisticated and smart, but could be so enamored with official statistics that are provided by, the US government. And that puts the blinders on. Well, those are blinders on what you might consider the independent variable side. And I've been talking usually about the dependent variables, but it's the same kind of challenge, really, to be working as an independent intellectual and not directed in all the subtle ways that you get seduced by the state to define what it is you're trying to explain and what you're going to look to for explanations. I mean, obviously I could ramble on since I've been rambling for half an hour, but I'm going to stop and see what you guys comes to mind, because I can be talking in my own head for the rest of the whole period and not connecting. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Although I think we'd like to hear a lot of while you're talking in your head, it will be very fascinating to us as well, to understand the whole processes of your thought. I think this is a great opportunity to hear from you and discuss from you. We shared your paper as well. I've read it. We also discussed seduction of crime and some of your work on methodology as well. By far, I don't think we have Katz experts here, but we try as much as possible to interact. And I think a lot of us might have questions to interact and develop from that brilliant exposition there. And I think where I would like to start maybe is from drawing this trajectory and how do you came about doing what you do, which is so differently from the seductions of the state. I think that's a question that it's always in the back of my mind. I'm reading all these authors, and all of them, they have some groundbreaking position, some groundbreaking perspective. So Stuart Hall, for instance, decides to study the whole discussion of how meaning translates into understanding phenomena to mass media and to the police behavior and so forth, and puts a whole new light into aspects that used to be, assumed that they're just that way, and you could just translate that in statistics, for instance. And then you have all these other frameworks, and your work is especially relevant to that because you make a huge transition, and I do see. You did mention, of course, the tradition of the Chicago school, from Mead to Bloomer and Howard Becker, of course, which we all know. We have a sort of feeling of how that is important to the pragmatist thought that is fully embedded in critical American thought. However, you are one of a kind. I mean, there are few like you. This is true, right? Despite being an important tradition in criminology, or not criminology, but in social thought in America. And so it always comes to me, how did it came to you? What was your process from the non-event to the stages? There's something there that drew you into this and made you have this contribution. I think this trajectory, this history is something that I'm curious, and many of us are curious as well. And then, of course, from your talk in itself, I think there's a lot of things that could be elicited there, right? And then we can further develop. But I think that starting question in itself is something that I'm drawn to, and I would like to start there. And
okay, so I can respond to that in all kinds of different ways. I just wrote a preface for the neighborhood book I'm working on, which is massive. And it's like 750 pages now. I don't know if it's going to end up or could get published like that, but it's like Hollywood from 1870 to 2010. And I come out very differently looking at urban life than my colleagues again. And so I'm anticipating the reader's going to ask this question. Why do you see things so differently? And I mean, I'll just very quickly, if I don't know if this is going to work, but I'm not going to go on it on this, but just to convey what I'm saying. The big movement in urban sociology in the last 50 years is basically to say it's the developers against the people. It's the capitalists in coalition with the politicians against the people, against the renters, against the wage earners, and so forth. And my take on that is that was true up and into the time these authors were writing. But their writing itself changed the whole dynamic. It was part of a social movement where people generally started to believe that, so it was no longer true. There was a book written, The God That Failed, and it was about the communists, the people who were communists in like the 1920s and 30s, who after Stalin finally started to realize, oh my God, this is really mass murder. And so they abandoned. And so Jane Jacobs, I don't know if you know her, but she was a protester against these developers and politicians in New York and Greenwich Village, sometimes called Saint Joan. And so she was like the saint that retired because she was so right that basically it became part of a social movement that has been building up equity wealth and homeowners and giving renters powers to basically seize ownership rights over the places they rent. And so it's kind of reversed its meaning. So I was anticipating people are going to say, how do you come to this? And how come other people don't see this? And so I did a little biographical preface for the book. And it's basically where I'm coming from personally. And I don't know that this is really very helpful, but it's one way to answer your question. There are probably more helpful ways that I can get to. But one way is that I came out of a home where my father was basically a lawyer offered a job by the Communist Party in the 30s, which he declined, though he was very sympathetic to Roosevelt and the New Deal and social welfare. And then in the 40s, the mob came to him and offered him basically, if you will, work for screw the union on behalf of the employer. And so he turned them down. He didn't even know it was the mob, but later on, it was a famous mobster and that was the atmosphere I grew up in, hearing that that's the way to be independent. So be suspicious about any. So whenever I hear like a Bourdieu or I hear Kant or anybody who has a political, I'm suspicious. I'm like constitutionally suspicious of moral righteousness, of political indoctrination, even if it's a new form of political indoctrination. That's so probably in a personal sense, that's the answer. In a probably more useful sense, I can say that well, I came into sociology at a law school. It made me very skeptical about a lot of the things that sociologists were doing, just because coming out of law school, you're very skeptical about how people use language, whatever. And then at Northwestern, I got into an environment where Howie Becker was a big influence. And John Katz, who's not as well known, but he was an ethnomethodologist and a lovely man and just a wonderful mentor and somebody who could convey big ideas with everyday details. And the ethnomethodological or phenomenological approach also says don't trust how things are formulated, get to the experience itself. And Becker, the outsiders, use your own experience. What he was in some sense an autodidact. I mean, his first writings were about jazz musician playing and marijuana smoking. And that was from his own experience. So if you use your own experience and then you see what the academics make out of it, what the law makes out of it, what culture makes, you realize they're getting it wrong, and you should trust your experience because that's the truth of what you know. So you become critical there. And so, participant observation and my Hollywood project is based on like 40 years of living and having connections with people in the low-income Latino area, in gay areas, in the Hills areas, among these Orthodox Jews. I mean, these are people that places I lived and people I know. And when I read the urban sociology, what they make of it, I realize I've got something to say because they're getting it wrong. They get some of it right, but they have their own interests, so they get it wrong. That's why, kind of Howie Becker, and I'm writing a piece now for an issue of the journal Qualitative Sociology, which collects a lot of the Becker students because he died a little while ago to do an issue. But it made me think about why he never liked the idea of the word ethnography. He always liked participant observation. Maybe because ethnographers were these people who went to Samoa, like Margaret Mead or whatever, and they went far away. But also, he was trying to say, use your own experience, what you already know, and get into places where you live so that you can draw on what you already know, and then you can be critical. So that was one set of influence. But another very important set was like Don Campbell. At Northwestern, Becker was open to all kinds of people doing other kinds of work. Chris Winship was there. Christopher Jenks was there. These are people who are very sophisticated quantitative methodologists who later went on to Harvard. They were part of the influence environment. And Donald Campbell in psychology, who, with others, wrote on quasi-experimental design. And that was very influential. It's a little handbook. It's like a brilliantly, it's gone through many editions. And Cook and others have expanded it and continued. But I would want all graduate students in the social sciences to read that book because it helps you think about causal explanation, all the different ways that causes can show up, can work their effects that you might not realize, kind of a checklist. And so it makes you very critical about, just one causal explanation. And then I think also, for some reason, I'm not quite sure why, when I did my dissertation was on lawyers who work with poor people on civil matters, I put in a historical aspect of that. Because I don't know, from early on, I had this sense that time, you can't neglect time. You have to see change. And okay, I was looking at the careers of the lawyers, how they change over time within an organization that was changing over time. So it had like 100-year history. It wasn't such a long period of time that it was so intimidating to study. But still, I got committed to looking over time. And once you do that, then you look at the thing you're trying to explain, how it's changing over time. Andrew Abbott has written a very important article on time and a lot of other things on time, but he has this one article, I don't remember what he calls it, but it's very well known and cited. So I would say everybody should read that too, because you don't want to leave time out. How the phases, things go through, and the career analysis. I think that was the career of a butcher, the career of a real estate broker. I guess Everett Hughes influenced Becker, and Becker picked that up, and that became part of my DNA. So, first days on the job, the mistakes you make, how you change from being a novice to being practiced in doing anything, including doing crime. If you want to do violence, it's not necessarily something you know how to do. People who kill their spouses usually have attacked them in less fatal ways, obviously, but they've attacked them in a variety of ways before, and they build up to it, and violence becomes comfortable. So somebody beheading somebody, I wonder how unless, if you're in some religious ISIS kind of organization that says do it, that's one thing. But if you've worked your way up to that, if you do it without somebody forcing you to do it, you've worked your way up to that. So there's a history to it, there's a career to it, there's a set of practices. And that generally is not what's going to ring politically, but it is causally going to be very, very crucial. Yeah, so I always felt, okay, somebody like Don Campbell, if he looked at my work, what would he say? I mean, he was a very nice person, but brilliant. I mean, very severe, multiple kind of distinctions that it really changes your kind of intellectual DNA when you absorb those things. And then I think how did I get to Merleau-Ponty? I don't know. I started to read. I'm not sure how I got into it, but I remember reading the end of his Visible and Invisible, the intertwining, the chiasm in English. I don't know. You probably find it in Portuguese because I'm sure that's been translated. I read that for 10 years before I got substantially into it. I could absorb it. I knew something was going on here. And I just let that get into my DNA. And I also became convinced that poetry is part of social life. And maybe, I think we all, I don't know if I can point to my experiences, because I think we've all had these experiences where you've been struck by how poetry has its own force. But it meant to me, I remember when I was a teenager, I was reading Tennessee Williams' play, The Glass Menagerie. I don't know if you guys know, it's very well known in the States, but it's basically a play he wrote about his family in the South, and his mother raised him with his sister. And there was no father around. And the mother explains to somebody, where's the father? How come there's no father here? And she says, he was a telephone repairman who fell in love with long distances. And it appears in the play once, And it may be Williams as the narrator, I think he says that. But then later in the play, it appears again. She says it to a visitor. And then you realize, oh, that phrase is not just a one-time phrase. That works for her. That has power. That has charm. And so when I, like in the Hollywood book, there's a lot of biographical interviews that are about how people found their mates, broke up, got back together again, how they found where they lived, how they work. And it's in their own words because I taped these, and I'm very happy I did. I did it with two others, graduate students. And years later, looking over these tapes, there's just so much poetry in it. The language that people, it's just, you couldn't come up with it. I couldn't, certainly. I'm not a kind of writer that could come up with that stuff. But I think that's from Merleau-Ponty, part of the influence. But I was open to that because I was open to plays and to playwrights who understood the power. People can't live without poetry. If you understand that causation is done by the people, they cause their conduct, right? Nobody's making anybody do something in the end. They have to cause their conduct. Well, the poetry enables them to do, enables Amanda in this play, the mother, to make sense of her life. It's a buffer. It just changes something very bitter and harsh into something positive and a vehicle that can carry her through. If you see that people are making their own causes, then the poetry in represented in the distinct way they describe things, do things, their emotions, you start to attend to that. And if you understand, okay, you have to, as a researcher, in an original way, look at the thing you're trying to explain, people doing the things, then okay, that's part of it. The distinctive language, the badass, for example, I have a chapter on the ways of the badass. I mean, why is that phrase so effective? In New York, the mob guys, the Italian mob guys were called wise guys. They finally picked that up in the media. The media picked up finally, after kind of 70s, they started to get more naturalistic and they picked up some real stuff. But why do they need a phrase? What is that? Well, that's the phenomenon. You can't ignore that. That's a distinctive phenomenon you're after anyway. So it's a long answer to the influences. Sometimes I do think when you ask people to explain themselves, their own causes, I wouldn't take that as valid in any research. I never ask people why. Why do you do this? I always ask them how. And I've tried to answer your question, not as a why question, but more as a how I came to do these things. And these are some of the passages on the way.
I think it would be interesting to hear the others. They might have some questions to you, but if I might add a little anecdote here, when I was doing field research in prison, I remember I had some basic training methodology in ethnography and so forth, for example, observation, interviews, and then of course your article came in and they mentioned you should always ask how, right? Focus on the how, never on the why. And ask why. Why should we focus on the how? Why can't we ask the why? I mean, I understand the processes are key and so forth, and it was some kind of a blank stare, and right, and they said, well, because the how explains the why, and so forth. Well, I said sure. So I said, let's try it, right? Let's try it. And I went to Fielder. I was doing some interviews, and I was focusing on the how and trying to focus on the how. Of course, this is not an easy task. I mean, it sounds easy, but it's not at all. And I was trying to focus on the how. And interviews or participation is always a negotiation. There's something there. And at some point, they said, I feel there's I'm actually having a conversation here. Maybe I can ask why, right? And I went to the why, into the why question, and it's fascinating. So when I ask the why, because when I ask the why, the person just look at me, blank stare again. I fell back into that moment, like you know, I was the dumb one asking the question back in a classroom, and look at me and like, I don't know. Yeah, sort of like, you should know, maybe. I don't know. You're asking the questions. The why is on you somehow. And it's an interesting anecdote that I drew directly from your insight, your article in this discussion.
Well, it's interesting that people do make a distinction, though, that this person was sensitive to that. Yeah, it's a different kind of provocation. You're trying to bring something different out of me with that question than with the how question. Yeah.
So I'll leave the other people to much more interesting questions that I might have. So guys, feel free. Anna.
Hi, nice to meet you virtually, of course. My name is Anna. I am a third-year PhD student here at the University of Missouri, St. Louis. And my internet, for some reason, is kind of awkward today, so please let me know if you can hear what I'm saying. But okay, thank you. So I'm not an ethnographer, but I do empirical research, interviewing people. I'm kind of getting started with quantitative methods as well. And I have a question about methodology to you. So in Seductions of Crime, you kind of blend ethnographic observations with interpret theory. How do you decide when a narrative is sociologically meaningful versus simply vivid storytelling? Because to me, I find it hard to kind of make things make sense. So I was wondering how you make that decision.
Yeah. You know, the best way to kind of proceed is to have a specific example and see if we can see what the alternatives are to talk about it. I wrote a paper called Culture in and Culture About Riots using the Rodney King case. And when narratives are in the action, that people are telling a story to themselves or to others, you know, to do a robbery, you've got to tell, you as the robber have to convince the people you're robbing that this is a robbery. That's a narrative. Okay, a robbery is a narrative, but it's a folk narrative that you have to convince of the people. So there's one thing about the analyst having their narrative, but the first task in research, I would suggest, is to see the narratives that people are using to make their behavior effective. You know, we're in a narrative. Okay, this is a session that's got an hour and a half. We've gone an hour. Now you're the first person who had the nerve to ask a question. Thank you for taking the step, because I know it's often intimidating. But you know, as you and I talk now, we have to be aware that we're in an hour and a half session and we can't go on for 45 minutes now. We have to tailor, you have to tailor what you ask me, and I have to tailor how I respond to the narrative we're in. It's a practical narrative. This is a kind of a session as a beginning, and it had, you know, a phase where I presented, and then it had a phase where Victor asked a number of things, and now it has an open phase. And maybe there are other people, we don't know. Maybe you're the only person who ask a question. So we don't know how long to do this, but we have to work that out. And I have to work out how much I'm going to say now, anticipating maybe there are other people who want to ask questions, so I shouldn't go on too long. Or maybe there aren't anybody else, so I should go on a long time. But that kind of regulation of what I say now, I have to do on the understanding of the phase I'm in this project, in this event, which is a kind of narrative. So the narrative is in every phenomenon. Anything you study, the people, they don't do it like that. To do a robbery, you have to come in, you have to get attention of the people, you have to convince them that it's a robbery, you have to get the money or whatever you're grabbing, and then you have to get out. It has several phases. And you, the robber, know you're organizing yourself within a narrative as you understand it, but also at some point you have to make the other people understand this is a robbery. I remember one little thing. I used something from a Woody Allen movie in the book about he's one of his Take the Money and Run, one of his movies. He's goes into a bank to rob it, and he puts a little slip to the bank teller, and the bank teller picks it up and says, "This is a gub? What's a gub?" That his handwriting is so bad that he can't convince the teller this is a robbery because he doesn't look like a robber. He looks like what he is, a little inoffensive guy. So, but if you come in, you're a big guy, you know, and you put a piece of paper there, the robber, the teller probably doesn't even have to look at the letters. They know this is you're saying this is a gun. So that's the narrative being used to make the action happen. So I don't know if that's what you have in mind, but it's the actor's narrative that's the first task. In everything we're doing it within a narrative. That is, every moment is within a trajectory. This interaction we're having is within the trajectory of this hour and a half session, which I probably should respect and stop talking now, not to go on to it. I don't know if that's responsive, but
That's
Thank you.
great place where you're studying. I love the work that's come out of University of Missouri, St. Louis over the years.
Oh yeah, you're probably familiar with Dr. Lee Slocum, or not?
I'm sorry?
Maybe. You are probably familiar with Dr. Lee Slocum,
Okay, yeah.
or not?
Little-
Yeah, probably not. I think yeah.
There's other people who've are and still are working there who've been very, very influential. Because they've done these series of interviews with active criminals on how they do it. And that's the uniqueness of the data set, really. And, you know, I would say if you really want to make it in academia, the big way is to create a unique data set. A lot of people are trying to do different kinds of statistical manipulations of established data sets, and they can do great work and they can make it, but if you have a unique data set, and that's why ethnography has some appeal, you know, then other people use your data set. That really is a big contribution that gets rewarded in the academic career. So get data that nobody else is, don't put yourself in danger, but somehow get the data that nobody else has been able to get. And then other people will come in and they may have different analyses than you. They may argue with you, but they'll respect you and they'll honor you because you've helped them in their work. It's very practical. You develop new data that nobody else has. You're really helping other people do their work.
Violeta has a question as well.
I'm going to try to make this question, but I'm a bit confused myself, so I don't know if I'll be as clear as I'd like to. But firstly, I'd like to thank you very much for being here with us. As we mentioned, we read your book, Seductions of Crime, and we discussed it at our study group. And I was responsible for the small presentation about the book, so I read it, and I was very fascinated by it because here in Brazil, well, I'm speaking from a small situational, I don't know, thing because it's my personal experience. But when we study criminology, we begin by these very big authors that are going to look to the system and criticize the system and find social meanings to crime. And then when we read your book, it was like this, I don't know, this big opening where we started to think about crime from a different perspective and then begin to think about it through the subjectiveness, right? Through the the sociological aspects and everything. And I have some difficulties understanding how can we mix both things, because we understand that there are social factors that they are involved to the existence of crime, to the action of crime, but also there are many things that are kind of like mysteries to us. And the existence of these mysteries make me very uncomfortable with research and everything. And I believe that this is something that many researchers feel. And so I'd like to understand better, how can we avoid being deterministic, meaning that we put social characteristics as causes of crime, also understanding the difficulty to access the mysteries of personal crime. Like we say, okay, this person in this situation committed this crime, but someone else with a very similar life and a very similar subjectiveness may not make the same thing. How do we understand this gap? And how can we research knowing that this is very difficult to understand? I don't know if I made myself clear.
Yeah,
I am myself, I'm very confused. I mean,
no, it is clear. I mean, it's something that we all always live with. So, you have your own language for it, but it's a very common dilemma. It's maybe our chief dilemma. And what I'm saying is, I don't want to use the word subjective, like go for the subjective. I want to put it in more kind of familiar conventional science terms. Look at the thing you're trying to explain. Look at its variations. Look at the data, instances, and the thing you're trying to explain, the explanandum or the dependent variable. I guess that phrase sounds more statistical. So for qualitative people, I like to use explanandum, the thing you're trying to explain, and build up an explanation about variations in the thing you're trying to explain, which in the first instance should be people over time, before doing it, starting to do it, doing it, the phases of doing it and not doing it anymore of a given act. And what's great about that is that you're controlling on a lot of social conditions, because the person's social class hasn't changed, their ethnicity hasn't changed, their gender hasn't changed from before doing it to after doing it. But a cause has changed, right? So you can get some sense of cause from that. Then you can start to build out from that. In seductions of crime, I do that with male-female violence, and I do that to some extent with race. Why are males overrepresented in violence as compared to females? And instead of saying that there is something in male genetics or the way males are socialized, which is the way a lot of people would do it, I say that violence is a way of being male. It's a way of being a hard guy. Physically, most violence, you have to make your body tense. You have to harden up. And I think for women, I argue, you have to overcome that challenge that it's unfeminine to do that with your body. Now, whether you agree with me or not, that's an illustration of how to work from the explanation of the causation that I work up by being close to the phenomena, looking at people getting before they do violence, as they go into and get out of violence, the stages they go through, and the metaphors that come alive, what it is to become enraged, what you do with your body when you go from being humiliated, which is a down thing, to being rage, which is up, and from blue to red in a way. It's a whole series of metaphors you live through. I start off with that, but then I work from that to the background, what I call background factors, or these structural conditions or more general phenomena. So yes, that is a very relevant question, but there is a way of working with it. But if by starting with, and it's a different way of working with it, by starting with the variations in the thing you're trying to explain. So if we had more time or in another setting, we would do like a master class, and I would ask you to tell us what it is actually you're studying, and then I could apply these ideas to your project, but we don't probably have time for that. We got like 15 minutes left, but that's a great way of doing a session as a master. What Howie Becker used to call a master class. I've done it on occasion, and it's a good way of teaching.
That'll definitely be helpful to all of us, not only to Violeta, though I think she would benefit the most. I think we would also have some of the benefits from that. I don't know if there are any other questions. Anna?
So one more question. Out of curiosity, what has been kind of misunderstood about your work over the years that you wish scholars would kind of revisit and try to work on?
I heard the first part. What's been misunderstood? And then you said that you asked what?
Misunderstood about your work
Right.
that people kind of, misinterpret about your work and then that you would like
Yeah.
them to revisit.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. Yeah. People like often with the sneaky thrills chapter, what they do is they take that and they interpret it as if I'm saying, this is why people steal. And then they say, no, people have materialistic reasons for stealing. They need the money. Well, I'm not trying to explain why people steal. What they do is they convert my explanation of a kind of distinct phenomenon. How do you construct a sneaky thrill? Which is only some of the things that are called theft. There are lots of thefts. The professional booster, shoplifter, is not doing it day by day for a sneaky thrill. They're doing it, they have demands on themselves. They need to buy drugs. They need to get money for this and that. They are part of a crew of people, and they're called on to go and so forth, and they have a routine. They're not trying to do a sneaky thrill. They're doing theft. It's a different phenomenon. So what people basically don't hear is the need to redefine the thing you're trying to explain, the explanandum, the variation you're trying to explain. And for me, the variation was not theft or not theft, stealing or not stealing, but before you start a course of action that becomes a sneaky thrill, to how you build it up, a sneaky thrill kind of theft, to the phases you go through and then transition out of. Again and again, that's the misunderstanding, that they try to take the conventional definitions of crimes like theft or murder. It's not all murders, it's righteous slaughter. At some point early on, I say a lot of things that are coded as murder and prosecuted as murder, this is the most common kind. But, in other times, and sometimes in places, drug marketing, violence, murders are more numerous than righteous slaughter. So it's a subtype. It's more, Othello kinds of murder that I'm talking about. At that transformation in emotions, those series of methods, that prior history. And so people try to just keep working the way they always work. And so they're using conventional categories and they say, oh, Katz is wrong because sneaky thrills doesn't explain the variations in thefts and the police statistics. Yeah, it doesn't. But that's just because, it requires really saying, I'm going to do a course of investigation. I think, frankly, by the way, Victor, in response to your question, I had the advantage of being in departments and universities that were willing to support me doing this. I was not in a criminology school. I don't know whether criminology, a lot of criminology schools might not be happy to see somebody diverting so far from the official, the politically relevant, the kinds of research that's responses to state legislators. If they say, what's our money being used for? Even though my career was at a public university mostly, it was insulated enough that it gave me the freedom to do that. So I was privileged in that sense. I think I was very much helped by the fact that Harold Garfinkel was a prominent member of my department, and what he did was seen by people as much crazier than anything I did, and they were still willing to support him. So that he, led the way, ethnomethodology, which people should but don't understand, made it much easier for me to continue this course. People do mathematical sociology, network analysis that nobody understands outside of their little group, and they get support for that. So there are some places where you get that, and there are other places who want to say, come on, how are we going to reduce the crime rate in this state? If you're not doing that, we're not going to fund you. So I didn't have those pressures.
We might have space for a small question if anyone wants to add into that. Just this talk. There's so many things coming out of as a reflection, but I don't want to steal time from them because they read it, discussed it, and so forth. So.
One of the things that comes to mind, I stopped teaching just before COVID, and I basically have an emeritus status. I'm still affiliated with the department, but I haven't been doing teaching kinds of sessions. This is very, very enjoyable for me. But one of the things that I realized is that I've always wanted to try to understand better. When you participate like in teaching or one of these sessions, you generate your own energy. Like you can feel tired or sleepy or bored, and then the thing starts, and all of a sudden, it's kind of like a magical thing. The energy starts to develop in the process. I've always wanted to understand better how that happens. It's kind of in the course of doing it, you develop the motivation, which is very much kind of a Howie Becker kind of perspective. His thing on marijuana was, it's not that people were predisposed to smoke marijuana or, they were a particular kind of people. It's like in the process of doing it, they learn, they acquire the motivation, and that happens. That's I think it happens in a lot of criminal activity, things that are called criminal or deviant activity. You develop the motivation, you develop the people who are beheading people in prison, how they develop that motivation. And over time, that's really fascinating. How do you come to do something like that? How do you come to rape somebody? How do you come to find that attractive? Nobody wants to study that. I don't know why. Because they want to, because they want to condemn it, because maybe they think if you study, you're too sympathetic. But, you have to understand it's not like inevitable that people will want to rape other people. Yeah. How do you find that even attractive? What becomes seductive about that? I keep waiting for somebody to take that on. There are so many fundamental topics that, what do people think that, people would rape if they weren't stopped? Like everybody has a rape tendency and you have to stop it, versus that you have to learn how to look and interact with and interrelate with people in a certain way such that becomes compellingly attractive. It's amazing. Anyway.
That's definitely. I mean, just a couple of questions there that have been poorly addressed in general by social research as a whole, and not least criminology. There's a question from Beatrice. She wrote in the chat, and I think we can use the last couple of minutes for that if you're okay with that. I'm going to translate it here. Because I think it's pertinent, although she wondered herself if it's pertinent, but it is. She wondered, how do you deal with the description of crime without getting into some kind of romanticization of whatever is studied? Or if you have already faced or that criticism coming out against you, which that it's a easy way, I think, cop out to sort of challenge your work of sort of doing this kind of romanticization. Have you faced that challenge, and do you think that's something that research ethnography should also address?
Yeah, I think it's a perfectly valid question, and part of the answer is there's a certain sampling bias in what I've studied. In order to find the data that's easiest to work with, I look for extreme instances. So these tend to be highly dramatic. The empirical answer is I try to give the data or references so that people can check it out themselves. You can say that poetry, if you start to see how poetry seduces people, attracts them, compels them, motivates them, can be used as an explanation of their conduct. You can give the details of how they embody that poetry. They use it, state it, or embody it. The gestures, words, versions of words, so you can document it. So it's not a problem of you laying on something that's not in it. So in writing, you always have to be going back and forth between your analytic writing and the details of the phenomena. Up and down, up and down, up and down. That's the good writing. I know that some of my writing, like I was rereading this start here that I did in theoretical chronology, it's way up there. It doesn't go down, but it was a theoretical piece. But when I'm working on my empirical studies, I'm always trying to go up and down. I'm always trying to go up and down. And when I'm, reading student work or colleagues' work or submissions for journals, often what I'm saying is, please, go up and down. You're too long in the data, or you're too much in the ideas. Get me back down to the data. And the data, it has to be something you can document. This is from field notes or transcriptions of recorded interviews, or something reported by somebody else, and you can point the reader to that so that you're not making up the poetry. You're not the one coming up with the phrase, he was a telephone repairman who fell in love with long distances. It was your mother who said that. You remembered it from your mother. You got to show where that came from. But there is a valid sampling bias in that, in talking about sneaky thrills, I'm not talking about the average theft. I'm talking about a certain kind of theft. Why? Because it's the kind that enables me to show this way of working on crime matters. I'm not talking about, the person who gets up every day to go to shoplift because that's their work, and for whom it's banal and for whom it doesn't have the excitement. And it's just like going to work every day. That wouldn't be so perhaps romantic. It would be more banal. And so I am explicitly acknowledging, yes, I'm sampling for in that series of studies, those that are more dramatic, because that subset, but I think it's empirically valid for that subset. But it's perfectly valid to say, yes, not all thefts are like this. This would be a romanticized view of all theft. I cop to that, as we would say. I acknowledge that. But I think it's valid for sneaky thrills, for that subset of theft that for whom the participants have misunderstanding and meaning.
Yeah, fascinating. So there's a somehow, I don't know if this is fair, but somehow there's a need for the romanticization to some degree in order to actually get some of the data there, get some of the study there. And the main fact is acknowledging that, not ignoring or pretending it doesn't exist somehow. I don't know if that's
I mean, I
fair.
think I also had the advantage that in doing, since other people hadn't worked this way, I could do this to show another way of doing the study of studying crime and deviance. Maybe as time goes on, if more and more people were doing this, it would be harder to just select this kind of more dramatic subset. Yeah.
I want to really put there a word to thank you, which is I could not thank enough for your generosity and your time with us. I appreciated it significantly.
It's great to make connections, and I hope we'll keep up in the future. And your researchers and students, if you want to contact me in the future, feel free. And yeah, this is what I do. I enjoy it. This is it generates energy, so it's a pleasure for me.
I think the energy of coming here and doing this, it has been mutual, and we created the interest out of this moment as well.
A couple of years ago, I was in Fortaleza, Bahia, and Rio, and we have some friends who live in Fortaleza and Rio. And in the next couple of years, I hope to get down to South Brazil, so maybe I can make a connection with some people in the South.
That would be wonderful. That would be wonderful, and we'll definitely look forward to that and try that as well. Once again, Jack, dear Professor Katz, we're very glad to be here, and with this, we close the semester of discussions with the practice of critical criminology.
Okay, thank you.
I hope you have a good day, and we'll be meeting hopefully